The sun had barely set over the Atlantic when the echoes of the Mar-A-Lago summit began to reverberate through the hallowed halls of the capital, signaling a seismic shift in American foreign policy. Senator James Vance stood before the press, his voice carrying the resonance of a movement that had successfully reclaimed the mandate of peace through strength on the global stage. He argued that the meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu represented the definitive end of an era defined by strategic hesitation and half-measures in the Middle East. According to Vance, the president's ultimatum that Hamas must disarm immediately or face a literal hell on earth was not a threat but a necessary moral clarification. He maintained that for too long, the international community had indulged a cycle of violence by treating a designated terrorist organization as a legitimate political stakeholder. Senator Sarah Whitford, however, viewed the optics of the Florida meeting with a profound sense of trepidation, seeing it as a reckless departure from established diplomatic norms. She contended that the hell to pay rhetoric, while perhaps effective for domestic political consumption, risked incinerating the fragile ceasefire that had been painstakingly built over months of multilateral negotiations. Whitford argued that demanding total disarmament as a non-negotiable precondition for humanitarian reconstruction was a recipe for catastrophic failure and renewed bloodshed. To her, the president was essentially holding the lives of 2 million civilians hostage to a military objective that many experts considered technically impossible to verify. She warned that bypassing the traditional role of the State Department in favor of a personalist, transactional diplomacy would ultimately alienate America's core European and Arab partners. Vance countered this critique by asserting that the previous administration's obsession with multilateralism had resulted in nothing but a bloated bureaucracy of stalemate and systemic Iranian enrichment. He praised the president for cutting through the diplomatic noise to establish a hard red line that the entire world could finally understand and respect. In his view, the disarmament mandate was the only logical pathway toward ensuring that the billions of dollars earmarked for Gaza's reconstruction would not be diverted into subterranean fortresses. Vance insisted that the American taxpayer would no longer subsidize a perpetual war machine disguised as a humanitarian crisis under the watch of a weakened United Nations. He framed the Mar-A-Lago summit as a masterclass in bilateral leverage, where the United States finally stopped asking for permission to protect its most vital regional ally. Whitford remained unconvinced, pointing out that the exclusion of the Palestinian Authority from these high-level discussions was a strategic blunder of historical proportions. She noted that by completely sidelining the moderate voices within the Palestinian political spectrum, the Trump-Netanyahu alliance was effectively radicalizing a new generation of Gazans. Whitford emphasized that security for Israel cannot be bought with iron and fire alone, but must be anchored in a credible political horizon for the Palestinian people. She characterized the president's approach as a Vegas gamble, where the stakes were the stability of the entire Levant and the credibility of American moral leadership. The senator warned that if the second phase of the peace plan collapsed due to this rigidity, the ensuing vacuum would be filled by even more extremist elements. The debate then shifted to the role of Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, whom the president had once again tapped to lead the disarmament and stabilization efforts. Vance defended this decision by highlighting their previous successes with the Abraham Accords, arguing that private sector efficiency was exactly what the moribund peace process required. He claimed that traditional diplomats were too invested in the two-state solution dogma to see the emerging reality of a prosperous, integrated Middle East led by economic interests. Vance argued that the appointment of trusted personal envoys sent a signal of unwavering commitment that no career bureaucrat could ever hope to replicate in the eyes of regional monarchs. He believed that the direct line between the White House and the Prime Minister's office was the most effective tool for rapid de-escalation through decisive action. Whitford took a sharply different stance, arguing that the privatization of American foreign policy eroded the institutional integrity of the U.S. government and bypassed vital congressional oversight. She questioned the legality and ethics of allowing individuals with significant private business interests in the region to dictate the terms of a sovereign nation's reconstruction. To her, this was a clear return to crony diplomacy, where personal loyalty was prioritized over expertise, historical context, and the long-term national interest. She stressed that a peace plan built on the whims of two leaders and their inner circles would lack the institutional durability needed to survive the inevitable shocks of regional politics. Whitford called for a return to a process that involved the professional diplomatic corps and respected the nuances of international law and human rights. Vance shifted the focus to the looming shadow of Iran, asserting that the Mar-A-Lago meeting was a clear warning shot aimed directly at the Ayatollahs in Tehran. He argued that the president's willingness to support an Israeli strike on Iranian ballistic facilities was the ultimate deterrent against a wider regional conflagration. Vance maintained that the Maximum Pressure 2.0 campaign necessitated a unified front between Washington and Jerusalem that left no room for strategic ambiguity or daylight between the two nations. He suggested that the previous policy of appeasement had only emboldened Iran to use its proxies as a shield while it raced toward a nuclear threshold. The senator concluded that the world is inherently safer when America's enemies are genuinely terrified of the consequences of their provocations. Whitford argued that this rhetorical brinkmanship was exactly what could trigger the very regional war that both sides claimed they wanted to avoid. She noted that Iran's internal political dynamics were highly sensitive to external threats and that such aggressive posturing often strengthened the hand of the hardliners in Tehran. Whitford advocated for a strategy of principled engagement and regional de-escalation that would bring Iran back to the negotiating table through a combination of targeted sanctions and diplomatic incentives. She expressed deep concern that the president was giving Israel a blank check to ignite a conflict that would inevitably draw American servicemen and women into another Middle Eastern quagmire. The senator insisted that the lessons of the last 2 decades of war in the region had been completely ignored by the current administration in its pursuit of a tough guy image. Vance dismissed these concerns as the anxiety of the old guard, who had presided over decades of American decline and geopolitical retreat. He argued that the American people had voted for a president who would prioritize national interests and the security of allies over the abstract approval of the global elite. Vance pointed to the award of the Israel Prize to President Trump as a historic acknowledgement of his unique contribution to the survival and prosperity of the Jewish state. He framed the bond between Trump and Netanyahu as a partnership of wartime heroes who understood that history is written by those who have the courage to act. To Vance, the critics were simply unable to comprehend a world where American power was used unapologetically to reshape the global order in favor of stability and freedom. Whitford concluded the first segment of the debate by reminding the public that true leadership is measured by the ability to prevent conflict, not just win it. She cautioned that the euphoria of a successful press conference at a private club should not be mistaken for a durable or just peace on the ground in Gaza. She vowed that her party would continue to demand transparency, accountability, and a commitment to the basic human rights of all people caught in the crossfire of this conflict. Whitford argued that the legacy of this administration would ultimately be judged not by the prizes it received, but by whether it left the world more or less dangerous than it found it. She remained steadfast in her belief that a lasting peace required more than just the threat of hell. It required the hard, often invisible work of justice and reconciliation. The discourse surrounding the Mar-A-Lago summit shifted into a more granular analysis as the specific parameters of the Gaza 20-point Prosperity Plan began to leak from high-level briefings. Senator James Vance characterized the framework not as a traditional aid package but as a comprehensive corporate restructuring of a failed territory. He argued that the president's vision treated Gaza as a distressed asset that required a total overhaul of its management and security infrastructure before any real value could be generated. Vance maintained that the previous 3 decades of international oversight had only succeeded in creating a terrorist industrial complex that thrived on perpetual instability. He emphasized that the new plan would replace the inefficient United Nations bureaucracy with a streamlined board of governors composed of American and Gulf Arab business leaders. To the Republican wing, this was the ultimate application of the art of the deal to the world's most intractable geopolitical problem. Senator Sarah Whitford immediately countered this narrative, labeling the 20-point plan a blueprint for a privatized occupation that stripped the Palestinian people of their agency. She argued that treating a humanitarian crisis like a bankruptcy proceeding was fundamentally dehumanizing and ignored the deep-seated political aspirations of the local population. Whitford pointed out that the plan's proposed special economic zones would likely become islands of wealth surrounded by a sea of disenfranchised and desperate civilians. In her view, the complete absence of a transition plan toward Palestinian statehood ensured that these economic hubs would remain perpetual targets for resentment and radicalization. She warned that without a clear political horizon, the Trumpian prosperity was merely a gilded cage that would eventually be shattered by the same pressures that broke previous peace attempts. The senator stressed that peace cannot be sustained by the promise of jobs alone if those jobs come at the expense of basic civil liberties and national identity. The debate then veered into the volatile territory of the West Bank, where the Mar-A-Lago discussions reportedly touched upon a paradigm shift regarding Israeli sovereignty. Senator Vance defended the administration's refusal to echo the traditional condemnations of settlement expansion, arguing that the settlement freeze policy had been a failed relic of the 1990s. He asserted that the reality on the ground in Judea and Samaria had changed irrevocably, and that American policy must reflect the current tactical environment rather than nostalgic maps. Vance suggested that by acknowledging Israeli security control over the entire region, the United States was providing the ironclad certainty necessary for long-term investment. He dismissed the notion that such a move would spark a regional uprising, claiming that the Arab monarchs were far more concerned with Iranian drones than with West Bank zoning laws. According to Vance, the president was simply being honest about a situation that his predecessors had spent decades obfuscating through diplomatic doublespeak. Senator Whitford reacted with visible alarm, describing this realistic geography as a death knell for American credibility and a violation of the foundational principles of international law. She argued that by tacitly endorsing the annexation of the West Bank, the administration was turning its back on the very rules-based order that the United States had spent 80 years building. Whitford emphasized that such a move would not only alienate the entire European Union but would also provide a perfect recruitment tool for extremist groups from North Africa to Southeast Asia. She cautioned that the United States would lose its moral standing to criticize territorial aggression by other global powers if it sanctioned the same behavior in the Middle East. The senator insisted that a one-state reality without equal rights for all inhabitants was a recipe for systemic inequality that would eventually force Israel into an existential crisis. To her, this was not a new realism, but a dangerous abandonment of the democratic values that supposed allies were meant to share. As the financial implications of the Gaza Reconstruction Fund were scrutinized, the role of Jared Kushner and his regional ties once again became a flashpoint of the debate. Senator Vance lauded Kushner as the only person with the requisite trust from both the Israeli Prime Minister and the Saudi Crown Prince to facilitate a multi-billion-dollar investment deal. He argued that the traditional diplomatic corps had been given 30 years to solve this problem and had failed precisely because they lacked skin in the game. Vance maintained that the private sector approach ensured that every dollar spent on a Gaza pier or a solar farm would be protected by the highest standards of security and accountability. He framed the fund as a Marshall Plan for the 21st century that was built on the solid foundation of the Abraham Accords rather than the shifting sands of UN resolutions. The senator concluded that if the Gulf states were willing to foot the bill, the United States should be providing the leadership to make it happen. Senator Whitford was quick to challenge the ethics of this crony-led reconstruction, suggesting that it blurred the lines between national security and personal profit. She raised serious concerns about the lack of congressional oversight over a fund that would essentially dictate the future of a strategically vital region. Whitford argued that the Palestinian people were being treated as collateral in a real estate transaction between elites who had no accountability to the public. She questioned how the US government could ensure that these projects would actually benefit the average Gazan rather than just enriching a small circle of well-connected contractors. The senator stressed that a peace plan built on secret negotiations and private equity was inherently fragile and lacked the legitimacy required to survive a change in leadership. She called for a return to transparent, government-to-government diplomacy that prioritized the long-term stability of the region over short-term financial gains for a select few. The conversation grew even more heated when the topic turned to the president's specific warning that there would be hell to pay if the hostages were not returned by his inauguration. Senator Vance interpreted this not as a reckless threat, but as a masterpiece of strategic clarity that had already begun to shift the internal dynamics of the remaining Hamas cells. He argued that for the first time in years, the enemies of the United States were genuinely afraid of the consequences of their actions. Vance asserted that the hell-to-pay doctrine was the only language that could break the stalemate and bring the captives home to their families. He claimed that the president's willingness to use the full weight of the American military as a bargaining chip was the ultimate deterrent against further escalations. In Vance's view, the world is always more stable when the American president is perceived as a man of his word who is not afraid to strike. Senator Whitford countered that this cowboy diplomacy risked igniting a firestorm that the United States might not be able to contain. She argued that by setting such a public and violent ultimatum, the president was backing himself into a corner where his only options would be total war or a humiliating retreat. Whitford expressed deep concern that this rhetoric would be interpreted by the Israeli far-right as a green light for an ethnic cleansing campaign in northern Gaza. She pointed out that hell usually ends up being paid for by the most vulnerable civilians who have nowhere left to flee. The senator warned that the president's words were being translated into every language in the Middle East and was serving as a rallying cry for resistance rather than a prompt for surrender. She insisted that true strength is found in the patience of diplomacy and the precision of intelligence, not in the volume of a social media threat. The potential for a grand bargain with Saudi Arabia remained the ultimate prize, and Vance insisted that the Mar-A-Lago meeting was the final staging ground for this historic move. He suggested that the Saudis were now ready to move forward without a preordained Palestinian state because they recognized the Trump administration as a reliable partner against the Iranian threat. Vance argued that the kingdom was focused on Vision 2030 and saw alliance with a high-tech Israel as the engine that would drive their future economy. He claimed that the 20-point Gaza plan was the face-saving mechanism that allowed Riyadh to normalize ties while claiming to have secured a better future for the Palestinians. In Vance's estimation, the president was on the verge of creating a Middle Eastern NATO that would secure American interests in the region for the next half-century. He believed that the critics were simply unable to handle the fact that Trump was achieving what the experts said was impossible. Whitford ended this segment by cautioning that a Saudi deal built on a palace-to-palace agreement was a dangerous foundation for American foreign policy. She reminded the public that the Saudis were demanding a massive civil nuclear program and a formal defense treaty as the price for normalization. Whitford argued that these were immense concessions that would bind American soldiers to the defense of an absolute monarchy for generations to come. She cautioned that the president was so desperate for a historic win that he might be overlooking the long-term risks of nuclear proliferation in the region. The senator warned that the deal of the century could quickly turn into the disaster of the century if it was not anchored in the rule of law and the consent of the governed. She remained steadfast in her belief that a truly stable Middle East requires more than just a signature on a piece of paper. It requires the hard work of building a just and inclusive peace. As the echoes of the Mar-A-Lago summit reached across the Atlantic, the fissure between Washington and Brussels transformed from a mere disagreement into a fundamental geopolitical divorce. Senator James Vance characterized the European Union's frantic condemnation of the Trump-Netanyahu pact as the desperate gasps of a continent that had grown comfortable in the shadow of American indecision. He argued that the Euro bureaucracy was more interested in maintaining its own self-image as a global moral arbiter than in actually solving the security crises that threatened the Western world. Vance insisted that the president's decision to bypass the traditional quartet framework was a necessary surgical removal of a diplomatic organ that had long since stopped functioning. To him, the era of American foreign policy being held hostage by the veto of nations that refused to fund their own defense was officially over. Senator Sarah Whitford viewed this scorched earth approach to the Atlantic Alliance as a strategic catastrophe that only served the interests of Moscow and Beijing. She argued that by alienating the European Union over the Gaza Prosperity Plan, the administration was effectively dismantling the most successful security coalition in human history. Whitford pointed out that the stability of the Middle East had always relied on a coordinated good cop, bad cop dynamic between the US and Europe, which the president had now replaced with a unilateral bad cop routine. She warned that without European cooperation on sanctions and reconstruction, the financial burden of the Mar-A-Lago vision would fall squarely on the shoulders of the American taxpayer. In her view, the president was trading 80 years of foundational alliances for the fleeting satisfaction of a strongman optic session in Florida. The debate intensified as rumors surfaced regarding a secret appendix to the Mar-A-Lago agreement, which reportedly outlined a joint US-Israeli contingency plan for the neutralization of Iran's nuclear hardening. Senator Vance did not shy away from the implications, suggesting that the maximum pressure era had naturally evolved into a maximum deterrence reality. He maintained that the president had made it abundantly clear to Tehran that the days of strategic patience were buried in the sands of the previous administration. Vance argued that a targeted, high-intensity strike on Iranian proxy command centers and nuclear enrichment sites was the only way to prevent a nuclear arms race in the region. He framed this potential military action not as a pursuit of war, but as the ultimate act of peacemaking through the credible threat of overwhelming force. Senator Whitford countered that this secret appendix was essentially a roadmap to a global economic collapse and a Third World War. She argued that the administration was underestimating Iran's capacity for asymmetrical retaliation, which could shut down the Strait of Hormuz and send oil prices into a terminal spiral. Whitford emphasized that a military strike of the magnitude being discussed would inevitably result in boots on the ground to secure the fallout, despite the president's America First promises. She accused the Trump-Netanyahu alliance of engaging in a preemptive escalation that removed all incentives for Tehran to remain within the bounds of international inspections. To her, the Mar-A-Lago summit was less about securing Israel's future and more about satisfying a hard-right domestic base that hungered for a definitive showdown in the desert. The conversation then turned to the controversial proposal to permanently dissolve UNRWA and replace it with a new, US-managed Abrahamic Relief Agency based in Riyadh. Senator Vance defended this move as the only way to break the intergenerational cycle of victimhood that he claimed the United Nations had subsidized for decades. He argued that UNRWA had become a Trojan horse for extremist ideologies, and that its textbooks had radicalized generations of Palestinian youth. Vance asserted that by shifting aid delivery to a corporate-led model overseen by the signatories of the Abraham Accords, the US was ensuring that every dollar spent was a dollar invested in regional stability. He believed that the relief to rebellion pipeline had to be cut off if Gaza was ever to become the Singapore of the Mediterranean envisioned in the 20-point plan. Senator Whitford slammed this proposal as a humanitarian death sentence for millions of refugees who relied on the UN for basic education, healthcare, and food security. She argued that creating a new agency from scratch in the middle of a conflict zone was a logistical impossibility that would lead to mass starvation and disease. Whitford pointed out that the Abrahamic Relief Agency was a thinly veiled attempt to use humanitarian aid as a political weapon to force Palestinian submission. She warned that the collapse of the UN social safety net would create a vacuum that would be filled not by moderate businessmen, but by the most radicalized elements of the disenfranchised population. The senator insisted that the president was playing a dangerous game of societal engineering that ignored the basic realities of human survival in a war-torn landscape. As the discussion shifted toward the Middle Eastern NATO concept, Vance argued that the president was finally achieving the burden sharing that he had demanded since his first term. He claimed that the emerging alliance between Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Jordan represented a regional solution for regional problems that would eventually allow American troops to return home. Vance suggested that the US role would shift from regional policeman to global arms supplier and technological backbone, a move he described as a win-win for the American economy and national security. He maintained that this new security architecture was the only way to permanently contain Iranian expansionism without requiring a permanent American military presence. To Vance, the Mar-A-Lago summit was the cornerstone of a new world order where allies did more than just talk. They took collective responsibility for their own backyard. Senator Whitford remained deeply skeptical, noting that this Middle Eastern NATO was built on the shaky foundations of absolute monarchies and a right-wing Israeli government. She argued that the US was effectively providing a nuclear umbrella and advanced weaponry to regimes that did not share American democratic values or long-term interests. Whitford expressed concern that this alliance would inevitably drag the US into local sectarian conflicts that had nothing to do with American national security. She pointed out that the president was bypassing the Senate's role in treaty-making by framing these deep military commitments as memorandums of understanding. The senator warned that a NATO without shared democratic norms was nothing more than a mercenary pact that would disintegrate the moment the interests of its autocratic members diverged. The domestic political implications of the summit also became a point of contention, particularly its impact on the upcoming 2026 midterm elections. Senator Vance argued that the American people were tired of the endless wars and managed declines of the previous decades and wanted a leader who delivered results. He claimed that the image of Trump and Netanyahu standing together as vanguards of Western civilization resonated with a majority of voters who felt the world was spinning out of control. Vance predicted that the success of the Mar-A-Lago summit would be the death knell for the Democratic Party's foreign policy platform, which he labeled as apologetic and ineffective. He believed that the president's ability to project power without starting a new war would be his greatest legacy and his most potent political weapon. Senator Whitford concluded this part of the debate by reminding the public that results cannot be measured by a single weekend of choreographed meetings. She argued that the real test of the Mar-A-Lago summit would not be the headlines it generated today, but the casualties it might cause tomorrow. Whitford stressed that the Democratic Party stood for a principled strength that did not require the abandonment of allies or the violation of international law. She cautioned that the Trump-Netanyahu doctrine was built on a series of high-stakes bluffs that, if called, could lead to a catastrophic loss of American life and prestige. The senator vowed to use every tool at her disposal to ensure that the administration's secret plans were brought into the light of congressional scrutiny before it was too late. The conversation at Mar-A-Lago inevitably veered into the digital frontier, where the battle for semiconductor supremacy is currently reshaping the alliances of the 21st century. Senator James Vance argued that the president's insistence on a tech shield for Israel was a masterstroke designed to sever the tentacles of Chinese influence within the Mediterranean. He maintained that the integrated circuit is the new oil of the Middle East, and the United States must ensure its allies are wired into a Western-centric ecosystem. According to Vance, the previous administration had allowed Beijing to make dangerous inroads into Israeli telecommunications and port infrastructure under the guise of commercial investment. He praised the president for demanding that Netanyahu implement a digital Monroe Doctrine that would effectively ban Huawei and other Chinese state-linked firms from the reconstruction of Gaza. Senator Sarah Whitford viewed this digital decoupling as a reckless gambit that ignored the interconnected reality of the global supply chain. She argued that by forcing Israel and the Gulf states to choose between Washington and Beijing, the president was creating a bipolar Middle East that would stifle innovation and invite retaliatory trade wars. Whitford pointed out that China remains a primary purchaser of regional energy and a vital source of raw materials for the very technologies the president sought to monopolize. She warned that an overly aggressive tech embargo would only accelerate China's efforts to build a parallel, non-Western technological infrastructure that excluded the United States entirely. To her, this was another example of the administration's zero-sum worldview that traded long-term strategic stability for short-term rhetorical victories. The debate deepened as Vance highlighted the president's plan to transform the Negev desert into a global AI processing hub powered by American capital and Israeli ingenuity. He argued that by integrating Saudi sovereign wealth with Israeli tech startups, the administration was creating a Silicon Levant that would render Chinese mediation efforts obsolete. Vance asserted that the true measure of sovereignty in the 2020s is the ability to control the flow of data and the logic of algorithms. He suggested that the Mar-A-Lago summit had secured a commitment from Netanyahu to prioritize American-made hardware in all future national security upgrades. In his view, this was not just a trade deal but a technological covenant that anchored the Middle East's future to the American dream. Senator Whitford countered that this Silicon Levant vision was built on the shaky ground of surveillance capitalism and political exclusion. She expressed concern that the AI tools being developed for the Gaza reconstruction would inevitably be used to suppress dissent and monitor the civilian population with terrifying precision. Whitford argued that the president's disregard for data privacy and ethical AI standards was a gift to authoritarian regimes looking for a new model of social control. She cautioned that by exporting automated security to the region, the US was essentially subsidizing the creation of an indestructible digital panopticon. To the senator, the lack of human-centric safeguards in the 20-point plan was a moral failure that would eventually haunt American foreign policy. The discussion then turned to the shadow role of China, which had been attempting to position itself as the adult in the room through its 2023 brokering of the Iran-Saudi deal. Senator Vance dismissed Beijing's diplomatic efforts as a house of cards that would collapse under the weight of President Trump's renewed economic pressure. He argued that the Chinese model of non-interference was merely a euphemism for enabling terrorism while profiting from cheap oil. Vance claimed that the Mar-A-Lago summit had effectively neutralized China's influence by offering the Gulf states something Beijing never could, an ironclad security guarantee. He maintained that the president was the only leader with the transactional genius to make the costs of aligning with China far outweigh the benefits. Senator Whitford argued that this dismissal of China was a profound strategic blind spot that underestimated Beijing's Belt and Road persistence. She noted that while the US was focused on military hardware and ultimatums, China was quietly building the roads, bridges, and ports that would define the region's economic life. Whitford emphasized that the hell-to-pay rhetoric only served to make the Chinese model of stable authoritarianism look more attractive to regional leaders. She warned that a Middle East polarized between a US-led military bloc and a China-led economic bloc was a recipe for a new Cold War that would drain American resources for decades. In her view, the president was playing a game of checkers while Xi Jinping was playing a game of Go. Internal divisions within the Trump cabinet also became a focal point, particularly regarding the status of Jerusalem and the potential relocation of more administrative functions to the city. Senator Vance defended the hawks in the administration who viewed Jerusalem as the undeniable, eternal, and administrative center of the Israeli state. He argued that the initial move of the embassy was only the beginning, and that the Mar-A-Lago talks had explored moving US-funded regional headquarters to the Holy City. Vance asserted that this was a matter of principled consistency that finally aligned American policy with the reality of the ground. He dismissed concerns about regional backlash, claiming that the Arab world had already moved on and was more interested in the Jerusalem tech boom than in historical grievances. Senator Whitford reacted with sharp criticism, noting that even within the president's own circle, there were voices of caution that were being silenced by the more radical loyalists. She argued that the push to maximize the Jerusalem presence was a deliberate provocation intended to sabotage any future peace negotiations. Whitford pointed out that several career officials in the State Department and the Pentagon had reportedly raised alarms about the security risks to American personnel. She characterized this policy as being driven by a theological agenda rather than a pragmatic national security strategy. The senator warned that turning a political conflict into a religious crusade would make it impossible for any future administration to de-escalate the situation. The conversation shifted to the loyalist versus bureaucrat struggle that had come to define the second Trump term's foreign policy execution. Senator Vance praised the president for cleaning out the stables and ensuring that every diplomat in the field was a true believer in the Mar-A-Lago doctrine. He argued that the deep state had spent 40 years failing in the Middle East and that a new generation of disruptors was needed to achieve real peace. Vance maintained that the personal chemistry between Trump and Netanyahu was the most effective diplomatic tool in the American arsenal. He believed that the direct, unmediated communication between the two leaders was a refreshing break from the mushy consensus of the professional diplomatic class. Senator Whitford countered that this disruption was actually a demolition of the institutional memory that kept American interests safe. She argued that by replacing experienced regional experts with political appointees whose only qualification was loyalty, the president was flying blind in a region that did not forgive mistakes. Whitford highlighted reports of internal chaos and conflicting directives emanating from the White House, which she claimed were confusing allies and emboldening enemies. She cautioned that a foreign policy based on personal chemistry was inherently unstable and would evaporate the moment a disagreement arose between the two leaders. To her, the Mar-A-Lago summit was a Potemkin village of strength that hid a hollowed-out and dysfunctional administrative core. As the debate moved toward the New Jerusalem administrative expansion, the economic implications for the Palestinian residents of the city were scrutinized. Senator Vance argued that the Trumpian prosperity model would lift all boats, including those of the Palestinians who chose to embrace the new economic reality. He claimed that the 20-point plan included significant investments in East Jerusalem's infrastructure that would create thousands of high-paying tech jobs. Vance asserted that the president was offering a choice between prosperity and protest, and he believed the younger generation would choose the former. In his view, the Jerusalem Economic Zone would become a model for how commerce could bridge the deepest of cultural divides. Senator Whitford dismissed this as a cynical attempt to buy off national aspirations with temporary economic incentives. She argued that no amount of infrastructure investment could replace the basic human desire for political self-determination and dignity. Whitford pointed out that the New Jerusalem plan essentially formalized the displacement of Palestinian communities to make way for high-tech parks and government buildings. She warned that this would only deepen the sense of apartheid that was already being discussed in the halls of the United Nations. The senator insisted that a peace that did not address the fundamental rights of all Jerusalem's residents was not a peace at all, but a forced quiet that would eventually explode. The role of the American evangelical base in shaping the Mar-A-Lago agenda also became a point of contention between the two senators. Senator Vance acknowledged that the president's policies were a reflection of the values held by millions of Americans who saw the survival of Israel as a moral and spiritual imperative. He argued that this was the essence of democracy, a leader fulfilling the promises made to the people who elected him. Vance maintained that the spiritual alliance between Washington and Jerusalem was a source of great national strength and cultural clarity. He believed that the critics were simply uncomfortable with a president who was unapologetic about his own nation's religious and cultural foundations. Senator Whitford countered that foreign policy should be based on national interest and international law, not on end-times theology or the desires of a specific domestic voting bloc. She argued that by allowing a religious agenda to dictate regional strategy, the president was alienating the vast majority of the global community. Whitford expressed concern that the messianic tone of the Mar-A-Lago summit would be interpreted as a declaration of war against the entire Islamic world. She cautioned that this was a dangerous departure from the secular traditions of American statecraft that had allowed the US to serve as a neutral arbiter in the past. To her, the infusion of religious fervor into an already volatile conflict was like throwing gasoline on an open flame. The two senators ended the fourth part of their debate by clashing over the long-term sustainability of the Trump-Netanyahu world order. Senator Vance predicted that the 2026 midterms would be a referendum on the peace through strength model, and that the American people would reward the president for his decisiveness. He argued that the world was finally entering an era of stability through realism that would end the age of American decline. Vance believed that the Mar-A-Lago summit would be remembered as the moment the West finally found its backbone. He remained confident that the momentum of the Abraham Accords was now irreversible and would eventually reshape the entire globe. Senator Whitford concluded by warning that the momentum Vance described was actually a headlong rush toward a cliff. She argued that the Democratic Party would continue to offer a vision of strength through justice that did not require the sacrifice of human rights or the abandonment of international norms. Whitford stressed that the real work of peace would only begin when the theater of Mar-A-Lago was replaced by a genuine commitment to all the people of the Middle East. She vowed that her party would be ready to pick up the pieces when the current administration's house of cards inevitably came tumbling down. The senator remained steadfast in her belief that the American people wanted a leader who brought the world together, not one who tore it apart. The tension surrounding the impending inauguration has reached a fever pitch as the hell-to-pay deadline looms over the final days of the year. Senator James Vance argued that the president's ultimatum has functioned as a shield of fire, forcing the remaining captors to reconsider their calculus in the face of total annihilation. He maintained that the strategic clarity provided at Mar-A-Lago has done more to advance the cause of hostage recovery in 72 hours than 2 years of back-channel negotiations. Vance asserted that the world is finally witnessing the return of an American president who treats the lives of his citizens as a non-negotiable red line. To him, the countdown is not a provocation but a moral necessity that restores the value of American life on the global stage. Senator Sarah Whitford countered that this countdown to chaos has effectively stripped the United States of any remaining diplomatic leverage. She argued that by setting a definitive and violent deadline, the president has backed both the US and Israel into a tactical corner with no exit ramp. Whitford expressed deep concern that the hell-to-pay doctrine would be interpreted by regional actors as a license for indiscriminate scorched earth tactics. She pointed out that when the clock strikes midnight on January 20th, the president will be forced to choose between a catastrophic regional war or a humiliating loss of credibility. In her view, true leadership involves providing an adversary with a golden bridge to retreat, not a cliff to jump off. The debate then shifted to the emerging Abrahamic bloc and its impact on the traditional NATO alliance structure. Senator Vance argued that the 2025 summit solidified a new security architecture that is far more relevant to the threats of the 21st century than the aging treaties of the Cold War. He claimed that the integration of Israeli technology, Saudi energy, and American military might has created a monolithic deterrent against the Eurasian axis of Russia, China, and Iran. Vance maintained that if Europe wants to remain relevant, it must align itself with this new center of gravity or face permanent geopolitical obsolescence. He suggested that the president's Middle East policy is the first step toward a global NATO that prioritizes results over geography. Senator Whitford viewed this shift as the final abandonment of the liberal world order that had prevented a Third World War for 8 decades. She argued that by prioritizing transactional alliances with autocrats over shared democratic values, the administration was dismantling the very foundations of Western civilization. Whitford emphasized that a global NATO built on the whims of the Mar-A-Lago doctrine would lack the institutional resilience to survive a major economic or military shock. She warned that the US was essentially trading its reliable, democratic partners in Europe for fickle, authoritarian allies who would disappear the moment a better deal arrived. To her, this was not a new realism, but a dangerous retreat into a lawless world where only the strongest survived. As the discussion turned to the fate of Gaza under the 20-point Prosperity Plan, the concept of security through data became a point of intense friction. Senator Vance defended the plan's heavy reliance on biometric surveillance and AI-driven border management as the only way to ensure a terror-free reconstruction. He argued that the privatization of security would allow for a level of precision and accountability that neither the UN nor the Palestinian Authority could ever provide. Vance asserted that the Singapore of the Mediterranean could only exist if the rule of law was enforced by the most advanced technology available to the Western world. He believed that the people of Gaza would gladly trade their digital privacy for the physical security and economic opportunity promised by the Trump-Netanyahu pact. Senator Whitford slammed this vision as a digital occupation that would turn Gaza into the world's largest open-air laboratory for authoritarian surveillance. She argued that the use of American-made AI to monitor every movement of a civilian population was a gross violation of fundamental human rights. Whitford pointed out that such a system would inevitably be hacked or subverted, creating a permanent state of fear that would only serve to radicalize future generations. She cautioned that the Prosperity Plan was essentially a corporate contract that treated human beings as data points to be managed rather than citizens with inherent dignity. In her view, the administration was exporting a model of high-tech repression that would eventually be used against political dissidents everywhere. The economic implications of the Mar-A-Lago Accord were then analyzed through the lens of the petrodollar and the future of global trade. Senator Vance argued that the president had successfully tethered the Middle East's transition to green energy to American financial interests. He maintained that by securing a commitment from the Gulf states to keep the dollar as the primary currency for AI processing and semiconductor trade, the US had thwarted China's attempts to de-dollarize the region. Vance claimed that the Trump-Netanyahu doctrine had effectively turned the Middle East into an extension of the American economy. He concluded that this was the ultimate expression of America First, when national prosperity and national security were fused into a single, unbreakable strategy. Senator Whitford countered that the administration's aggressive financial unilateralism was actually accelerating the global search for an alternative to the dollar. She argued that the weaponization of the US financial system through the Gaza Fund would push neutral nations like India and Brazil closer to the BRICS alliance. Whitford emphasized that a global economy built on financial ultimatums was inherently fragile and prone to sudden, catastrophic decoupling. She warned that the president's attempt to monopolize the region's economic future would lead to a sanctions fatigue that would eventually render American economic pressure toothless. To the senator, the short-term gains of the Mar-A-Lago deal were being bought at the price of America's long-term dominance in the global financial order. As the debate reached its conclusion, the focus returned to the human cost of the hell-to-pay deadline. Senator Vance insisted that the president's willingness to embrace the burden of command was what the American people had voted for in 2024. He argued that the world is a dangerous place that requires leaders who are willing to make the hard choices that peace at any price advocates find distasteful. Vance predicted that the hostage release, should it happen, would be remembered as the greatest diplomatic victory in American history. He remained confident that the Mar-A-Lago summit had laid the groundwork for a Pax Trumpiana that would secure the Middle East for generations. Senator Whitford ended the debate with a somber warning about the fragility of peace built on threats and exclusion. She argued that the true measure of a great nation is not how many hells it can promise, but how many it can prevent. Whitford vowed that her party would continue to fight for a Middle East policy that was rooted in the values of justice, human rights, and international cooperation. She cautioned that the theater of strength at Mar-A-Lago would eventually have to face the cold, hard reality of a region that has swallowed up many deal-makers before. The senator remained steadfast in her belief that a lasting peace is something you build with your neighbors, not something you impose from a private club in Florida. The legacy of December 29, 2025, remains unwritten, as the world watches the clock tick toward the most consequential inauguration in modern history. Senator Vance and Senator Whitford have presented two irreconcilable visions for the future of American power and the fate of the Middle East. Whether the Mar-A-Lago summit leads to a historic breakthrough or a devastating conflagration is now a matter of time and the will of the leaders involved. The hell-to-pay deadline stands as the ultimate test of the Trump-Netanyahu alliance and its ability to reshape the world through sheer force of will. In the end, the American people and the global community will be the ones to live with the consequences of this high-stakes geopolitical gamble.